Well, it takes a village to get us right. So the recording begins a little bit late. We prayed our prayer on page 15 by St. Augustine, and hopefully you will pick that up if you're just coming on to recording. Okay, what I would love to do is very informally see if there's any confusion about how the books work or housekeeping or just how did it go week one, and you don't have to take a turn. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I knew that 30 weeks was a commitment, but it is a real commitment to read all of these readings and to think on them, you know, to write some thoughts down and see what you think. I did it all in one setting. And so I've decided that I need to do it on a daily basis. Because that was hours. So, but I found it fascinating, interesting, brought some thoughts to mind, and looking forward to the rest of it.
Thank you. Anybody else have an experience with materials?
I got confused. I was doing this and I was supposed to be doing that, and I was reading this, and I didn't get it all done. But what I did get done, I enjoyed, and I'm like Susan, provoked a lot of thought.
Are you on good footing on how it sort of is meant to go now?
Yes.
Okay. And reminder from your facilitator, not like you need my permission, but you've got my permission. Do what you can. In fact, maybe better said, do what you enjoy, and hopefully you enjoy showing up. But there are weeks where your life might be busy and you may not have time to do any of the reading. And if you'd still like to come and share what you think about believing a revelation or God or join into the conversation, please. Right? That's what we're here to do. Yes, ma'am.
I agree with Susan. I was kind of overwhelming in the beginning. I had missed the first 2 or 3 nights of trying to do it because I had other obligations. And so the 3rd or 4th night, I started in on it, and I realized how much time it was going to take to do it. And so I did spend a few hours that first night, and then I was like, okay, I've got to do this every night, and it's got to be, it's going to be a certain length of time. It's going to be it. But I find it very thorough, and so far it seems really good.
Thank you.
And you'll have some of the reading books,
Yes, I do.
because I didn't get one the other
And
day.
so let me give you one right now.
Okay. I think
And you
that'll
need a
make
reading
it
book as
easier.
well, Susan.
Yes.
And I've got the whole full set for you, Bob, the workbook and the. Okay, thanks for putting up with the housekeeping. Now, look, I hope you heard me say, I'm gonna try to facilitate this. And I may not do what you were hoping, which means you can say, could we talk about this instead? Yeah, or will there be time? Okay, so if I botch this, just help me learn, because this is your time and our time, and it needs to work for us. So there's a couple of ways we could consider doing this. One is by starting in with our believing and living questions. Another is just seeing if there were things that stood out to you as you read scripture, readings, and workbook. So I kind of want to open the door first to see if there were things as you were thinking through the scripture or the readings that maybe jarred you into thinking about belief and believing and faith-seeking understanding. Susan.
The thing that stood out for me is, I guess I've understood for a long time that I had a relationship with God, but it emphasized a very personal relationship. And I guess I hadn't really thought about it being a very personal relationship with God.
Hmm.
And so that stood out to me.
Just to reflect back, it's sort of, you got a nudge in the reading about not God's relationship with us, but with you in particular, and vice versa, alongside the kind of us you generally carry.
That is really a very personal matter between us and God. Most of us in the church have been raised in doctrine and dogma, and that's not the emphasis today anymore. And I had the experience of where God had to tell me for a very long time to sit down, be quiet, and listen. And I did that, and I walked with God all of my life. But since I have done more listening, paid more attention to God, it's like God and I have now become one. In other words, I feel the sense of God in me. But it was a long journey getting there. But the main point about it is thank God, I'm now in this loving relationship. That doesn't mean everything goes my way or anything of that sort. It's just I remember to ask God's guidance first. And sometimes I forget them. So it's a long journey. And I would think that most of us were very far along in that journey already. And maybe if you haven't had this experience of a one-on-one personal loving relationship with God, maybe it's time for that to be embraced in our lives.
Diana, please.
Okay, this is kind of, it talked about even doubting as a declaration of belief. And that made me think back when I got out of high school and started college. I remember a professor talking about people a long time ago, and they might have believed in this or that, or even just a rock, a boulder. And he said that it was because so people could deal with death. You had to believe in something, to go on, whether you lost someone or your own death. And so my cousin died last week, and he was brought up in the church and all that stuff, and I don't know if he never believed or at some point he chose not to believe, but his belief was that when you're dead, you're dead. And so occasionally over the years, I've wondered, maybe they're right. And then I feel so guilty thinking that, and then scared that God will punish me for thinking. But I really believe that in the afterlife, God and all that. And I'm sure it's because my cousin died that all this is,
This is an opportune moment.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad I'm wearing this because I want to say one of these things. I absolve you of that guilt that you feel. It's natural and it's holy.
Yeah,
And it's not a threat to
maybe I
God.
shouldn't think that. He's gonna zap me.
You didn't have to shoot on yourself. I think that is one of the core questions, though, that we get to ask when we think about belief. And I've been very jarred personally lately thinking about, what do I really believe God's going to do with me? With people I don't like.
Mhm.
And I don't know if it's okay to say, I'm not trying to short circuit any conversation. I grew up hearing it's all about what I believed about God that mattered. And I think that's so wrong. I decided it's God's belief in us that matters, not our belief in God. And our belief in God is going to frankly influence whether we enjoy the one precious life we have or not.
Mhm.
So I'd like to believe things that will help me enjoy the one precious life that I have, knowing that God's belief in me is greater than my belief in God ever will be. I don't mean that as an answer. I mean, like, as you said that, it struck in me, and I said it last week, it's when you listen to the Hamilton musical, King George says, I'll show you how much I love you. I'll send a battalion. I'll kill your friends and family to show you how
Right.
much I love you. Well, that was the God I grew up hearing about.
Right, right.
Except it wasn't just a one-time skirmish, it was gonna be eternal punishment. And God was just really mad all the time. I didn't think that set me up to enjoy the one wild and precious life God wanted me to live.
Well, one other comment, that's how his wife grew up, and I guess that's how he grew up too. And I think, what could I say to her? You know, you have all your cliches you say, or maybe an original thought you say to comfort them. And what do you say? I can't tell you what is the Lord now or what, I don't know.
Well, I think
And
if
I
we,
wonder if that disturbs him.
well, and I think it's disturbing. What you said is like a big part of belief that in some ways is disturbing for me, because if it's incumbent on me to believe the right things,
Mhm.
or it doesn't work for me, and somebody says something that is not in my belief set, I better fix them.
Right,
I better fix them. So when somebody's having a hard time, I'm going to manage the discomfort that their feelings bring to me by fixing their feelings. That's called emotional labor, by the way. Anybody ever done emotional? Oh, everybody here is a woman. So yes, pretty much. Right? You know what it's like to do emotional labor, right? I don't mean everybody, but you get this, right? And there's times, and I was talking to my spouse about this the other day. We were talking about communication patterns, and it came out as like, hey, you know, like I've got these close family members who are older than I am, and they're super loving and sweet, and they do these things to help me, but I have to manage their feelings. Like they expect me to manage their feelings. And I don't want to do that anymore. And then it got really scary because she looked at me and said, and sometimes I feel like I have to manage your feelings. And I thought, well, I know how that feels. I know how that feels to try to manage not just my own decision, but how you're going to process my decision. Well, I think we all get that at a certain point, right? And I hate to say this, but when I talk about core beliefs, I think I grew up thinking I had to manage God's feelings. God was angry, so I had to placate. God was disappointed, so I had to make it up. I mean, I don't want to say it's right or wrong, but I'll say there's not a lot of joy in that spirituality, if that makes sense. And I find myself doing it all the time. God, you must be disappointed. How do I fix your feelings?
But there's one way.
what do you say
for
instead?
One of the nice things is if you work to manage God's feelings, like pleasing Him, which is what you're usually trying to do, or you work to manage your spouse's feelings, which is what you're, and pleasing is again, what you're trying to do, you end up pleasing yourself.
I think sometimes, I do think sometimes, and I think maybe when it comes down to a position of love and gift instead of anxiety. And that's in the collect. This showed up in the Bible study, the men's group yesterday. The collect talks about, help us not to be anxious about earthly things. Well, I know what earthly things are. That's like the car and cash. I mean, everything's an earthly thing, isn't it? And I get anxious about my kids, but I like to think my anxiety is directed toward like making them become fully formed adults who are like responsible. Is that an earthly anxiety? Is all anxiety like not good? I mean, this is an interesting question. I'm trying to wrap myself around. And I think we all get, we talked about these values and how they can have shadows. Managing other people's feelings, or I want to say being aware of other people's feelings, is a really nice awareness. Controlling those things that you can't control is a fool's errand.
Being anxious is just a human characteristic. There's a difference between facilitating anxiety and debilitating anxiety. We have to have a certain amount of anxiety to propel us to take care of things, our kids or the money. But then if it gets too much, then it inhibits our ability to be effective and productive. I think God's
saying to us, when he says, don't be anxious, he or she is saying, relax. Do what you need to do, and I'll take care of the rest. Relax in me, rest in me, so that it doesn't get to that debilitating point.
I hope this doesn't feel off topic, because I think a major life event actually does produce anxiety. And because we have an expert at the table, my understanding psychologically is that anxiety is energy stimulated by an event, and you don't know where to put it. So it just is there, and your body's like an alarm system, but there's no completion to it, right? This is like people who have chronic anxiety are wound up and they don't know what to do. There's no catharsis for it. It's just a constant state of cortisol and adrenaline. Is that?
Yes, and this is an example of how the Bible is misinterpreted. Don't worry, don't be anxious. And then the traditions that you and I and some of us grew up in was, if you're worrying, you're a bad Christian and you're displeasing God. You shouldn't have any worry. You shouldn't have any anxiety. No, God made us the way we are. So that's okay.
I think, and this, Bob, what you said made me think about this. There comes this point in a relationship, and it's probably different for everybody, but for me, I have to fight really, really hard to let other people love me. That sounds really strange. To actually like accept and enjoy it and not feel obligated or like I don't deserve that or something like that. Like I have these sort of core feelings, and I have a lot of that in my theology background. Your righteousness is filthy rags. There's nobody good on the world. No one's dead good, not one. My mom is pretty good, by the way. I mean, you know, there's like these kinds of words that I took very, very literally and thought, oh my gosh, like I better manage this for God. And what's an interesting part, at least in my own marriage, the part of the thing that's been good for me and challenging for me is to just try to say, I don't have to know why you've chosen to love me, but can I accept that you have? and that's where I think like joy and love comes from, is not from trying to manage it, but rejoicing that it's already there. And that's where like gifts naturally come out and joy comes out, instead of trades and barters and exchanges and earning and proving and treadmilling.
I think one thing that really struck me this week, and it relates to some of what you said, Mike, is that I was raised early on in the fundamentalist religion. And it was that punishment, and you have to work hard and earn, and you can never earn enough, and you can never be good enough. And so you're going to get punished, and it's going to be really, really bad. And I just accepted that because that's what I heard. And what came to me this week was, why did my beliefs change? And now I believe in this loving God who made us in his own image and loves us and wants to have relationship with us. And I realized that I have foundation undergirding those beliefs because I've studied and read, and I trust in the authority of scriptures because it has endured for thousands of years. And so that makes me feel really confident that my beliefs are valid. And that gives me a lot of comfort.
You know, God is, God doesn't want us to have any feelings of inferiority or not worthiness or things. I know we were taught that way. And it's a journey to let go of that. But once you can let go and let God, it's amazing how the peace comes to you, and also how simply everything sometimes works out. Well, I started with that experience with Harvey when Harvey was coming. And I was standing inside my bedroom, and I said, okay, we were getting ready to leave. It was probably 1 o'clock in the morning because the waters in the house were rising. And I stood at my dressing table, and I said, okay, dear God, I put everything in your hands. Whatever your will is, it's yours. I've done everything that I can do to do my part. And it wasn't an easy journey, but everything worked out, and it worked out without a lot of pain or stress, you know. So it's, yeah, my 86-year-old idea went out the window.
You're doing exactly what I hope we would do, though, which is talk about what beliefs we have, what difference they make, and sometimes maybe there are beliefs that we can swap.
And you know, it comes down really to a matter of believing. In other words, when I say let go of the situation, but always make sure that we have done our part, you know, because we're in a partnership with God. And being in love with God and accepting God being in love with us is a beautiful relationship. And gradually over time, you grow in that sense of awareness. And so please write down those fears or false teachings and something and go burn them, you know, and let them go, because they are holding you back, not pushing you forward.
Yeah.
Well, I find believing to be very mysterious, because when I look at the world and you go back in history, I mean, there has been belief among a great variety of peoples. As a matter of fact, there's great belief among a great variety of peoples today. And I think we're all looking at the same God, just in different ways, I think. So that's why I think it's very mysterious.
You know, Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, was caught up in this big argument about whether or not reality is real. Because I don't know if you ever had this thought, everything could just be a dream. Like, all of this could just be a figment of my or your imagination, right?
Somebody's already said that in scientific world.
Yeah. And so what Immanuel Kant said is, at a certain point, we can't know a thing apart from ourselves in itself. The German phrase is the Ding an sich. But he said, you know, like people who are not educated couldn't care less about that. They get up in the morning and they put their feet on the floor and they go and milk the cow, and they don't bother thinking about whether the cow is real. And that's because belief is mysterious. It's as much subconscious as it is conscious, right? I mean, I find myself doing patterns that I don't believe in, but you better believe I believe in them. I do them every day, you know, like, and I don't weigh out, am I going to do this thing or not? Or is this making a difference? I decided a long time ago, I'm going to do that. And it's become a rule of life. And that's as much a belief as a cognitive essay is. And maybe two other ways of hearing that, or tangents. You probably heard seeing is believing, but the flip of it is that what we believe determines what we will see.
Yes.
So believing is seeing, or put a different way, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And so I think like this is an interesting chapter to begin with, because it invites this conversation. What are we seeing? Frankly, like, is that what God wants us to be looking at? Not because of God will be disappointed if we look at things that are like less on God's mind, but because we'll be disappointed, I think.
Question.
Yeah.
There was a question in the book that I didn't answer because I didn't really know how to answer. At what points are you at odds with contemporary philosophies of believing? And at what points do you find you two think truths are not absolute and everything is relative? How does these affect believing? And you know, I hear the term regularly, oh, well, everything's relative. Or, you know, I didn't really understand how to process that. And what are contemporary beliefs compared to what? Compared to 2,000 years ago?
Yeah.
Okay, so we believe that women are fully functioning members of society that we didn't believe 2,000 years ago. You know, is that a belief that has changed over centuries? What are some other modern beliefs, you know, that kind?
Well, I think that's the real invitation. And if I don't want to be introduce controversy for its own sake, but I would say gender fluidity is a really big contemporary issue that people are choking on. Under the people who are above the age of 40 are choking on it. That's maybe how I should say it. People 40 and below are not choking on it at all. That shows it's contemporary. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Okay, you're right. So I wasn't sure exactly.
I
where
don't
the
think you
contemporary
need to
comes-
get into like, well, I read Michael Foucault's Pendulum book and it's got all of this, you know, I don't think the question is aimed academically. I think the question is, do you find yourself being jarred by what seems to be a different stance on believing or different beliefs culturally, religiously, in your family environment?
Okay,
And how do you navigate those? And I think your other question that you mentioned is about relativity. And I think that's a great question for us to think about. How do you handle relativity?
Would one way of doing that be by paying attention and just listening or taking a pause and giving it a little time to work itself out? Knowing it adequately, I'm in sync with you about what the topic is. At the time, every now and then my brain goes. But anyway, that's what I came to understand relativity as being, is that, yeah, you know, relationships matter. But do we make them? And of course, then it goes from there. Well, then what kind of truth is at stake here? Or is there still something I need to learn? Maybe that would be of help. Is that what relativity might look like?
Could be to you, but this is for everybody else to weigh in on too, right?
Okay, well, where are y'all at with that?
Well, I guess I think relativity means whatever is important to me. And for instance, one of the things that I have trouble with is the prosperity gospel, because I don't believe it's valid. I don't believe it's biblical. But what the heck? I'm not going to those churches, so it's not relative to me.
What's the prosperity?
God blesses people who are faithful financially or with success.
Yeah.
So if you're like a good Christian, you should expect a luxurious lifestyle.
Okay. I haven't been to one of those churches.
Oh, I would say we
I've
all
learned
grew up in those
something
churches.
today.
If we're honest,
Yes.
we grew
Yeah.
up in those churches.
Yeah.
I am trying to believe in a church different from that, but I find myself getting pulled back into it sometimes. You get what you pay for. I will be grateful if that is not one of your core beliefs, but I'm suspicious it might be.
Really?
I am suspicious of that. Yeah. God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. I got a speeding ticket. What'd I do wrong? You sped. Right. You know, right. I mean, this is sort of how that goes. My Sonicare toothbrush broke. What did I do wrong? Maybe nothing.
Nothing.
Maybe. But there's a part of me that asks the question, what did I do? So if you don't ever find yourself asking the question, what did I do to deserve this? Or looking at somebody and saying, they got what's coming to them, I would say good on you. I just know I do. And I don't want to, but I know that I do.
I heard on the news last weekend, it was a woman whose a family member had been killed. And they finally caught the person that they think did it. And they were interviewing this woman. And she says, well, I have forgiven him, but I hope he gets what he deserves. But
And what does he deserve?
Right.
That's one of our beliefs, isn't it? What do we deserve? Do we deserve to get paid for what we've contributed? Or do we deserve grace? I think the way we believe changes a lot of how we interface with each other on that question. I often find myself thinking, person doesn't deserve that grant, student loan forgiveness. You just rattle on down the line. They don't deserve. So, what does that say about my belief in God? Is God going to give me what I deserve?
I hope not.
God has, well, I'm actually trying to reframe the question to I hope so, because God has decided I deserve grace.
Yes.
Now, isn't that an interesting belief? The grace is your birthright, not something you scramble for. I'm not converted, but I want to be. I'm telling you that up front. I would like to be fully converted, because I still live very much in a ledger system. Most places I go, making a list, checking it twice is the naughty and the nice ledger, right? And I balance that out. And I can't help that I'm like a type A prime INTJ brain or whatever. That's just it. Maybe I'll be there for a while, I don't know. But I would rather not. And yet I'm afraid to let it go because I'm afraid I'll become unproductive. This is true about anxiety, by the way. People who suffer from anxiety, they usually give anxiety credit for their accomplishments. If I weren't so worried about this thing, I wouldn't have done it. Turns out there's no evidence to corroborate that. It's an internal myth. If I let it go, I'll become lazy. I won't do work. Instead of, my best work might come from a non-anxious place. I don't know what that's like. I'd like to find out.
You will when you are much older.
Well, may not be much older, who knows? And I know lots of people who are much, much older, who are much more anxious than I am, which is kind of hard to believe.
One they never learned.
Yeah. So I think this is a staging point for us to consider, and we don't usually do this. What are my goals in believing in God? What are my goals? Well, I want to get it right. I think I would rather get it joyful. I think that would be like a better goal for me. And what are the stages for me when the plane shakes and I find myself thinking I better get myself right with the Lord before the plane crashes? What are the steps so that that doesn't even come up in my brain anymore? Maybe I could ask the question the book asks. What makes it difficult for you to call yourself a believer?
I'd like to share a story.
Please.
This week I read, and it's about belief, but basically, I read that the Rice had this big thing this weekend with all of the space science and their 60th anniversary of JFK's speech. I was around a lot of scientists this weekend, and one of the things that I found interesting was it came up that the pictures we're getting back from the Webb telescope, those aren't what we would see. Those have been computerized. And if we actually saw what the telescope took a picture of, we wouldn't see that. We would see bright spots. And so that fascinated me. So I was like asking questions. Well, the Hubble took pictures and they saw little tiny specks out there. And then the Webb telescope went up and they're the ones taking the beautiful pictures. But what happens is that our eye has evolved to see light that comes through our atmosphere. So we have ultraviolet to infrared. But some animals on Earth see past ultraviolet and they see beautiful, intricate details in the flowers that we don't see. Then there's the super hot things that we don't see. So what they did is they took the image of those speckles and they shifted it to our visual field, but with a computer, and poof, it showed up. So I said, so you believe in things you don't see. And every scientist in the room was like, and one guy said, I know where you're going with this.
You caught us.
And I said, I mean, think about that there, what else is around us we don't see? You know, what else is on different planets that we're looking at through telescopes, but it's outside our visual light field that we don't see. But it fascinated me that we wouldn't see that if we just looked at it with our naked eye. It took them shifting it into our visual field to believe in something, but it's out there. What else is out there?
And that connects to the issue of what is relative. It's how do we see other people? We don't see that person. We see just an image, or we see just a little bit of what they let us see, but there's so much more. It's all relative, their history, their feelings. So it's like, you need to look closer, listen.
Put on some different filters.
Yes, yes. And we're coming from our perspective,
Yeah.
which colors what we see in them. So what is real?
That's a tough question, isn't it?
I cannot see airborne mold, but I am allergic to airborne mold, you know, and I cough and I sneeze but I can't see it, but I believe it's there.
Or to use
Because-
the word know versus see. What you can know versus what you can see versus what you believe. That's a big separation for me. Belief is what I can't know. And I think we get into a lot of problems in religion when people believe, but they use the term know. That's where we get into our fights about the nature of God. I know this. I know God. I know the Bible.
And that leads us back to the questioning. We started talking about questioning, and is it okay to question? Different churches see it differently. Different groups see questioning differently. Years ago, I was the leader of a small group, and they had lots of questions, and so we answered them the best we could. Some were mystery, and we couldn't answer them. But I encouraged questioning. That was good. That was holy. And I got a text from one of the women in the groups who was just crushed because she still goes to that church, and she had a question about a sermon. And so she had dared to email the pastor and ask a question. And she thought that was okay because it had been our part of our values in that small group. And she got a scathing email back, text back, how dare you criticize? And she was just crushed. I mean, their reality of questioning was so different than mine, and that's what I value. One of the things I value about the Episcopal Church, and especially this church. And my response to her was, your questions are not only good, but they're holy. That's searching.
That person viewed her asking a question as criticism,
Yes.
and that wasn't what she intended for it
No,
to be.
not at all. And she's a very respectful person. She wouldn't have been okay about it.
Well, you know, even in the Roman church, you didn't ask questions. You didn't read the Bible. You know, and so, yeah. But anyways, I just want to say that church isn't the only one that does that.
It's not denom by denom. Father knows best. Father knows best. I mean, that's just a thing that we have all had experience with or know somebody who has, right? Like what's safe? And it's an interesting thing that you said. So what if she was being critical?
That's okay with me.
God, pants, I can put my pants on, right? I mean, it's an interesting thing to separate. I do a job and my job is not me. So you're critical of something I did. I'm differentiated from that thing I did. There is more to me than that thing. I will always get something wrong. Always. I do think that's a challenge to belief for me, is that I grew up with this internal thing. You've always got to do it right. And I would say also for me as a clergy person, it's challenging because I'm very aware that people are going to project their expectations right on top of the screen right here. You're supposed to. You didn't. We've always this. It makes it difficult to call myself a believer sometimes. I honestly, when I'm in a new group of people, I try not to tell them what I do. Because I would rather them be interested in me than do that transference projection thing. And that makes it a little bit difficult, honestly.
That happens with educators also. I'm a retired principal, superintendent type person, and you get expected, or you've done it, well, I may or may not have done it correctly, but I did it because I thought this was the right thing to do, but that was always the expectation. She said so, so therefore it must be that. And that's a huge responsibility, and when you don't want it, it's too much to carry.
Take authority from lots of things. When you take authority from God and then use it to abuse someone, which is what happened in your case,
Yes.
you're really doing something wrong.
Makes it difficult for me to call myself a believer sometimes.
Well, I think we also need to accept the fact that there are most Christians today are in name only. And, we just have to accept them where they are. I mean, that's their choice, or that's the responsibility. Maybe it was wrong teaching or whatever. But the thing that is important is that we focus on our relationship, because then we'll be able to manage as God leads and guides us and do it right. But they're just people who in name only, and they're more interested in making money and going to football games than they are and even paying any attention to God.
I hear that feeling. And I also know I can easily have that same criticism lodged against me.
Okay.
People can say whatever they want to.
Oh, yeah. That's
Sometimes it's me lodging that criticism against myself. I've got one other thing that makes me hard to be a believer. This is like the hardest thing. I'm kind of at like a stalemate with it, but it's one of these justice issues. I adopted a child who'd been neglected some when he was first born. And all the books I've read, and the expert in the room agrees with what I'm getting ready to say. You may not agree, that's okay, but this is what the books say. When you're neglected as a child, the trauma of that is not healable, is not.
It's not what?
Not healable.
Healable, yeah.
That is the world, you will probably struggle with cause and effect the rest of your life. Even if you pretend you understand it, it won't like be your native language. And the questions of rejection and are people going to show up and hurt me again, probably not healable. Doesn't matter how much talking therapy you do or pharmaceutical therapy. I don't think I've misrepresented the data.
You're right on.
It's one thing to read that in a book, and it's another thing to have that in your home. And the blatant unfairness of that, that feels very unfair to me. That's not a feeling. I judge that as very unfair. It's a real obstacle sometimes. It's an obstacle.
and I understand that
I actually would not like you to comment on that because that was a very personal thing, actually.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It was so personal, I needed to not get it commented on, but I want to share that there are, actually, that's probably the biggest thing. I understand, I've made peace that people die. I've made peace that the dog dies, even though the dog should outlive us, like we all with dogs, we understand they should live longer. It's that one though. It's that one that there's no turnaround. That is just mind-boggling for me. And it pushes me to think, well, maybe it's so hard because I'm believing things about God that God would rather I didn't believe about God. That was my answer to that question.
Do you think the books are wrong?
No,
No.
I don't.
Okay,
That's the scariest part.
okay.
I'm afraid they're right. And my experience says they're probably right.
Right on.
And again, there's an expert in the room who does this, who's nodding her head. By the way, that doesn't mean people who were neglected are evil. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them, even though much wrong was done to them. But then what does going forward together as an individual, as a family, as a society, what does it look like? It's really, really hard. We understand no child deserves that. But if we're really honest, again, the deserve stuff really shows up when you start talking about immigration. Those people can't come into our country. What did you do to deserve to be born with this skin in this country? I didn't do anything that I know of. It's an interesting thing when we talk about what's ours, right? And there's a definitely understanding of how we manage resources, but not you is an interesting belief.
She agrees.
Amen. But I find that belief often, you know, and if I'm honest and I think, why am I Christian? Well, my parents were. If I'd been born in Saudi Arabia, I would be an imam, I think.
Mhm.
I would. So those people who are wrong, here's where we get to relativity. It's what they know. We're doing what we know.
So how are we selected then to be here or there?
Well, this is one of those great belief questions, and maybe we'll read this further in the book. If you're John Calvin, you say, well, God did in fact select. God said, number 6 is an affix, and number 7 goes to heaven. That's it. God planned it all out, happens like that. It's tough for me to live with.
Yeah.
Seems capricious, to say the least. Selection, I don't know, does God select, or do we inherit and live into and verify patterns? Or maybe there's more than 2 other questions, and I often find myself not sure what has traction for me. If I'm really honest, I drift around in those areas. What it was meant to be. We say that, right? It was meant to be. That's a strong feeling. I've had it a lot of times. I don't know what I think about. This is another challenge for belief. When I meet clergy who say, God wanted me to do this thing. Whoa, really? That's a degree of certainty I don't usually have. Most of the stuff I think is really important, I think is really important. But when I put religious language behind it, it's really scary for me. God wants us to have a pipe organ. Really? We might like one. Some of us might not like one. It's a thing. It could be a lovely thing to have, but it's a thing. I get scared. It's an obstacle to my belief. Because maybe you really do think that God wants you to have that, but I just don't have that level of certainty in my own life. I mean, I always inherently circle back, like, did I do that right? Is that really what we should have done? it's an obstacle for me.
I was talking with some friends last night. And when you get to be of a certain age, your conversation drifts to medical issues. It just does. It just does. Anyhow, we were talking and we thought, how did we get to where we are today? We never would have imagined it. And if you believe that God's in control of everything, which I don't believe he is, then why did I get to this place with my medical issues? And why did you get to this place with yours? But then where does free will come in? We make decisions in our life that if we'd made a different decision, our path would have gone a different way. You know, I don't believe God controls that. But what about free will? What exactly is it?
I'm not even sure we have free will. I think everything we do is predicated upon something in the past. I don't know.
Has anybody read War and Peace?
Long
Long
time.
time
You were
ago.
like trying to punish yourself. You read that book.
Yeah.
But that's the premise of the book. The premise of the book is the way you were shaped is fatalistic. It determines every decision you're going to make, right? I don't know if I want to go all the way there, but I could go 90% of the way there, right? I know what my kids are going to pick most of the time. Like 95% of the time. I know what they're going to pick, even if it's between two candies or two colors, right? So how free is that choice when it's known to me and it's somehow not known to them, right? Like this is an interesting thing, right? You can figure that out. And I know, like in certain situations, what my gut says. And if I think about where my gut came from, I came from life experience or from this thing my parents said at this moment that I still remember, and it's driving me to make this choice, right? So it does get a little mysterious and wonky, right?
You know, and I think, you know, when we talk about, you know, we talk about the afterlife, but if when I pass away and she passed away, if I don't know who she is after I passed away in heaven, then I'm not sure why I'm going to heaven. I want to know her in heaven,
And you will. That's my belief.
but,
You will.
but is my ex-wife gonna be there? I mean, I don't want to see her.
Yeah. And that's a good question, because I really don't know what I would do, what I'm gonna do if my father is there.
I don't, you know.
I'd like to believe that God will make me happy when I see my father there. I don't know that I can, but I would like to believe that.
Well, and that's a way to me, it's how we get from day to day to day to day, and how we live for long periods of time in a happy, and I don't mean to be kind of hokey about this, but at the end of the day, it's really what you carry in your heart and what you believe in that is going to take you to every place that you go to, and whatever, however that's going to happen, however that's going to come presented to you. I think, I don't know, it's pretty heavy thinking.
And it can maybe be lighter too. Like there's some lightness that can come out of that thinking. There was a book that somebody wrote that says, you know, journeying into grace is like falling. And falling is about the scariest thing you can do, to me, especially as you get older right here, right?
Yeah.
But even for me, if I go trail running, running on a trail is really scary because when you trip at a high velocity, that's a mechanism for spinal injury, right? Blow out your knee, all of this stuff. I've done only a few of those. I don't think I want to do them anymore. It's too scary for me falling. And I would also tell you that I have fallen out of a perfectly good airplane. I don't need to do it again. Once was enough. It was thrilling, actually, and once was enough. But the book sort of says, the race involves some falling. And it can be really, really scary if you don't think God's going to catch you. On the other hand, if you know that God is going to catch you, like my daughter knows her dad is going to catch her, throwing her up in the air and falling is delightful because there's no risk. She will be caught. Do I believe God will catch me? I don't know. Not all the time. I'd like to, not all the time.
Did anybody else take the quiz,
Did anybody else take the
take the
quiz?
quiz?
I did, yeah.
I did. I was surprised.
The one that was related to the list of values. that
Right.
went in the email last week.
In that my number one was kindness.
Your number one was what?
Was kindness. And my number two was humor. And my number three was love. I don't know that I see myself that way.
Janelle,
Well,
what was your
the first thing
experience?
I did was the value worksheet that you passed out
Mhm.
and tried to see how that was going to jive with the online version of everything. And it was pretty similar. I mean, I got honesty as my first one, hope and kindness. And I thought it was an interesting survey. I thought it was a lot longer than I thought it was. I thought it was very thorough. And it did sort of jive with what I picked out too on the value sheet. I thought it was good.
As I mentioned last week, I thought it was a stupid thing when I took it because when I look at this list, I know what's real important. And then I took that thing and it said creativity, and I thought that's not important. That is not my core value. And I've had to wrestle with whether it is or not, you know. Did anybody else take any time on the list of values, and are you willing to share any of that? I hope it was helpful or at least intriguing, but anybody else who spent time, would you be willing to share?
I did. I mean, I didn't get the survey
Yeah.
question, but I did work through this, and I did it through several days in the process of elimination. And I found it was really difficult the first time around, because I was like, well, no, yeah. You know, I just really struggled with it. But I thought about it a lot. I tried to not do my normal thing, like, what's the right thing to say? What's the right answer for me? What looks good? And I had to just continually say, no. Go with your feelings. And so I came up with compassion as number one, faith, family, and integrity. Now, I don't know if people would see me that way or not, but that's what I came up
It's interesting how similar we are. I had 3 of your 4, but I think I cheated in getting, I don't know that honesty was on here, but I think I cheated because I couldn't gel it down. So I looked at what quality have I marked that encompasses some of these others. And so I could choose that one and eliminate those others.
And thereby include all of them.
And include all of them, yes. I came up with community, integrity, spirituality, which is faith, and what else did I? Responsibility. So I had to read it before. I knew I liked you.
Yes, we are sisters under the
We are,
skin.
we are.
I wonder if everyone did this, if we'd all wind up getting similar. Because we're all here in this place at this time for this reason. So there have to be things about us that are similar.
it is very interesting to hear the difference between the core values you would pick for somebody and the core values they would pick for themselves. Responsibility, education, creativity, integrity. And I really hate the creativities there, but I'm trying to make peace with it.
That was my number one.
Creativity was, well, that makes sense.
Oh, yes, that makes a lot of sense.
That makes sense to me as a teacher. Creativity was number one.
I hope it's a cool exercise if you've done it or take time to do it, to like make some peace with that. Like, yeah, so maybe my core value is humor, and maybe I wish it were integrity, but humor is a gift to the world. Why would I want to hide that for something that doesn't resonate as strongly with me?
And humor is very creative because you have to see the nuances and create out of this something else.
2 for 1 there.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
And as with creativity, can have a really long dark shadow. We all understand that humor is a double-edged sword.
Oh, yeah. How it's
Yeah.
used.
Could the core values change depend upon the situation you're in?
I think so, and I think they can change as you age, because sometimes I think we're afraid of some of like who we really are,
Yeah.
and we'll prioritize, if you don't mind me saying, they're not false values, but they're like caricature values, and we'll pursue them, and that wasn't where our heart was all along. Sometimes we have what's called a midlife crisis. We realize we've been pursuing this stuff because we were good at it, not because it was life-giving.
I don't know about the rest of the women in here, well, and the men too, but as a woman, I think that what I thought my parents expected of me has pretty much worked out, or what I believed was important and going to Catholic school as a kid, and then going to regular high school in this very small town. But I'm pretty much that person. I feel very comfortable with who I am. I'm glad about how my life has worked out. I did not expect to have been married 3 times, but I did better every time.
You finally got it right.
Yes, I finally got it right. But anyway, this was very interesting. It's wonderful to listen to all of you talk and tell about your lives and stuff. It's really delightful to sit here and listen to this. Thank you.
I do want to be mindful of our time, and I want to make sure we give time to the stuff that we spent time reading. So I would like it, if it's okay, to turn us toward some of the readings and ways in which you had a conversation or still are having a conversation about how belief shows up either in this book or in the scriptures. Is that okay to ask? Just to get the ball rolling, I'll mention that when I read the Genesis passage, there's this phrase we learned in seminary, like where we learned to highlight, that I so often forget: I will bless you and you will be a blessing, which is very counter prosperity gospel. Whatever privileges you find yourself with or resources are meant to be distributed as a blessing to other people, instead of rewards for your own efforts or merits to be soaked in. Trying to think that this is what God believes, whether I believe it or not. that blessings are to be used to bless other people.
That's part of my prayer. My doctrinal prayer is, God, fill me with your love so that I can share that love with others.
Cool. Just out of regarding the first reading about Abraham and Sarah, came across an interesting note in this Bible that I had never thought of it that way before. It talks about how this is Abram was the first man, the first person to receive an invitation from God. In other words, if there are others before him, that would have to be elsewhere in other countries or something. But anyway, as far as the Hebrew people, Abraham is recognized as first person to be received, chosen to be a blessing.
Laura.
And
Sorry, she's about to go out the door. I'm just gonna close it.
And so, and he receives an explicit invitation because he is created in the image and in the unique relationship with God. And then it goes on, because their lives were so strange and had children at old age, was that reason it might have taken so long is that Abraham and Sarah, they had to learn what it meant to be chosen. It didn't mean life would be easy. It often meant that the weight of responsibility would be heavy for them from time to time. So in other words, these are human beings who have to learn. In other words, yes, God appeared and said, yes, I want you to do what. Okay, then, we don't hear God visiting until a few chapters down the road. So so these are, that made them a little more real to me. Say, yeah, like everybody else, they had to figure things out and they had to listen to God and, they had to get acquainted with this God. So anyway, that's what I got out of the first one.
The thing that stood out to me in the first couple of readings on day one was that there was a person who was chosen by God that just went without hesitation and just did it. And then there was this other guy, Moses, who was just a little bit more on the fence, a little bit more like, are you sure? Maybe I'm not the right guy. So I just feel like, they're showing us that, or they were showing me that there's people who just jump in to the water with both feet and just go in. And then there are some people who do it, but do it a little slower, a little methodically more than others. But they both believe, they're both chosen by God. I think we're all chosen by God. We're just some are more easier to do it than others, I guess.
Where do you locate yourself?
Definitely a little more hesitant. A little bit more questioning.
Chosen by God is an interesting concept to me. And when I was reading on day 5 here, I love the readings. These are very good. But the experience of believing and begins in an act of God. He, I guess, chooses, but he invites us. He invites everyone in. And then your reply, and he called that the first word. The first word comes from God, inviting you in, and then your reply is your belief. And that's the second word. And I found that very interesting because I've always thought chosen by God, was he not chosen because he doesn't believe? But God really does invite everyone. And that's where all the different religions come in. Everyone is invited in at one time or another.
Makes me wonder when you said that, if maybe Abraham wasn't the first person God asked. Abraham was just the first person that said, okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they, before him, they worshiped idols and they had gods, but they're not God, but they knew the act of worship, something bigger than them. So maybe God, this is the first time people saw idols.
I'm wondering if, even though they worshiped idols, they were still worshiping God, and the idols were only their finite culture or their brain. It's all they could wrap around that concept of God,
But it was something outside.
outside of
than them.
themselves, which is what I think of as God. I don't know, it's a question.
No, I agree with that, the ancient people, that's the only concept of God that they come up with, but they definitely believed it.
Which makes us, no, not, which might make us, some of us question, is our concept of God now the real kind, is it really real? Is reality, it's like the light in our eyes.
It's what we see.
It's what we see now.
Where someone said that God and religion is a way for us to understand the world.
Do we find it more difficult to believe in God if we did not have churches or crosses or images?
I think people under 40 and under are asking that question, and they're saying, actually, maybe we don't need that stuff. I don't, and that's giving credence to it, but you
Right,
realize every Christian denomination, except for the Mormon Church, is in full decline in the United States. Everyone. And part of it is I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious.
Right.
And that can bother some folk. And I think it actually ties in really well to the fundamental questions the book is asking us to kind of just think around a little bit. And I think what I heard Darlene and Kay saying as well is there's always this opportunity for us who have been nourished by, I mean, we weren't nourished by church in some way. It's kind of hard to imagine you'd be here, even if there were hurts along the way, right? Or that there's something in the tradition that's sort of drawing you closer. But I do think the question that I heard particularly Darlene call out, are there things that we've settled on and locked in on that are holding us back from a bigger understanding of God, just like at this time? Or where we can see, all of those people, they were thinking really hard about these statues. We always like to think that. People didn't think that God was a statue. They did not. It was an icon that represented something bigger than itself. Our church is full of that stuff, right? And I think it gets in, I don't want to be a provocateur, but I would tell you, to become clergy, we have to take something called the General Ordination exam, which is like the clergy bar. It's a 21-page essay exam taken over 3 days. They grade it, and then you get ordained or you don't. And if you don't do well, then they have to rehabilitate you and maybe take it again. And I just remember one of the questions from the exam went something like this. The local mosque in your town has burned down, and they would like a place to hold services. It's a tricky question because it says, you know, you're the rector of the church, and canonically you control what happens in the building. So will you give these people access to your building? And I wrote a 3-page essay on this that received no comment except for pass. And a little disappointing. And I shared this with my parish at the time where I was the associate out in Coronado. And it was really interesting to hear how they took the question. The first answer was, well, it would depend what kind of Muslims they are. The second answer was, well, they could worship in the fellowship hall, but not in the sanctuary. Well, why would that be? Well, the reserved sacrament's in there, and they could defile that. People can defile the reserved sacrament because they don't respect it like you do. This is an interesting question to think about. Because we all worry about sacrilege and desecration, and did I do the wrong thing in the church? Priests used to not give folk communion if they weren't being good actors. They'd say, I'll give it to you when you shape up. I kind of think all of it's idolatry, if you don't mind me saying, even though sometimes I celebrate it. I'm sitting back here and thinking, well, I mean, is God's faith in us so fragile that it needs our faith back? Or is the sacrament holy because it's undefilable? Like grace. Can you defile grace if it's given to you? I guess you just choose not to enjoy it, but can you defile it? And it's great to hear this story about Moses, who's like the hero of the Hebrew Bible. It's like, I don't think so. Nope, don't want to do that. Don't want to.
So John, how you're in good company.
I wish that we got more on Abraham. I wish there'd been like, and Abraham went home and pulled his hair around and flipped a coin 19 times to make sure this was the right thing to do. You know, like, actually the flatness of it scares me. Because when people hear a voice from God and do something, they fly planes into buildings and they go into churches and they shoot doctors who are OBGYNs. I'm not making those up. Those are like real stories, by the way. And God told them to do it. And they just did it. It makes me wonder, maybe you should hit pause on that and do a little more like Moses. Like, are you sure? I hope that makes sense.
You know, some of these people that go around shooting others and causing harm that we have today, you know, all of them, from what I have observed is that they're all very lonely people. And they find different ways to entertain themselves. And some of them learn all this stuff off of the internet. And the more you sit with those ideas, because you don't have enough distractions, or things are not making you feel like you are a person, it grows. And it begins to solidify. And, you know, they go on the internet and they find support for what they're thinking and so forth. And then they say, well, I want to have guns too. And of course, and then they go get guns. And they have this fixation in their mind for some reason. And we don't ever really know why. At least it hadn't been published as to why they went off into a tangent. But the thing is this, then reality. And so they're not thinking and like normal people do with other things to distract them. They are bent on that goal and they become completely committed to it, and there's no turning back. You know, and it's a sad, you know, it's a sad commentary, but that happens, you know. Even yesterday, I heard a report about the fact that if women smoke weed during the first 3 months of pregnancy, their child stands a huge chance of being born with some inability to learn or some other thing that, you know, might not go right in making their system. So, you know, people are deep. So, but anyway, that was a little different than what I first said. But the thing is this, that's my understanding of it.
If we have time, I wrote down things that I had questions about or that I thought were really impressive. Joe,
Yes.
cosmic justice is a marvel beyond human comprehension. Justice is not a principle or value to which God is subject. That confused me. Can you translate that?
And that came out of the book,
Joe, yeah, it came out, well,
the study manual.
the study manual on day 2. And I think what I wrote down was it probably in the notes of the Bible.
Okay.
Food Bible. It's, cosmic justice is a marvel beyond human comprehension. Justice is not a principle or value to which God is subject.
What page is that on?
It's on page 7. And it's in the reading from Job 42, 1 through 6.
What page in that?
In this book,
It's-
7.
He's just referring you
Oh,
to that
okay.
passage. in Job, yeah. It is an interesting question, and I wish I could answer it more fully, but I do think if it's okay to say, this is where like the way we speak sometimes creates beliefs that are like deeper than we think they ought to be. Like an earthquake will happen and we'll say, what an evil thing. That was evil. Well, no, the earth is made with tectonic plates, and if they didn't have earthquakes, the world would eventually explode, right? So releasing tension is good. Inconvenient for us who live in the San Andreas fault line. Inconvenient, but not evil. Or some theologians call that natural evil, like a hurricane. Did God send Hurricane Harvey? I mean, no. Did God create the weather so hurricanes happen? Yes. So in that sense, did God send Hurricane Harvey? Also, yes. God created a climate in which hurricanes happen. Is that evil? From our perspective, it's inconvenient. It's hurtful. Is it evil? And what I hear Joe saying is like, wow, I'm so wrapped up in my own human perspective. I don't really even know. Like I'm putting human standards onto God and saying, why is this happening to humanity? Instead of being able to hold the whole picture together. I don't know that I got a good answer. And I think part of it also depends on when we read scripture, not only what's in the scriptures, but what are we bringing to it? So does God design tests and tricks for our faith? Like, I'm going to give Ellen Maston cancer, and if she worships me and has enough faith, I'll take it away, and I'll be so happy with her. Maybe I just wouldn't worship that God. I don't find much worthwhile in that, if I'm honest. And there is an undercurrent to some of my thinking on that sometimes, right? And it comes back to a little bit about what we believe about other people. And sometimes we say, well, they're a monster and they're evil. And there's these interesting things like at least 90% of people who abuse their spouse saw their mother hit by their father. Now, I think about that and I say, well, those people really ought to know better because they saw the damage it did. And like the data is that exposure to violence inclines you to violence.
Learn behavior.
Learn behavior, even when it's not good.
That's right.
And so I think part of it, Kay, I often find myself when I'm really sure about what's just, how much of that is informed by my learned behavior.
That makes sense. Okay.
But there's not an answer to it. I do think that Job actually asks us to take a perspective change. The perspective is like what we call evil is often just inconvenient for people. Sometimes, and then where do we go from there? Where do we go from there?
I wrote that Job realizes God's control over everything. But then he invokes self-judgment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And I do wonder if there isn't like one of those belief questions dangling here. I have spoken of things which I have not understood, things too wonderful for me to know.
Yeah.
Not only maybe when we're doing theology do we do that, but when we judge our sister or our brother for carrying the load they carry. I wonder if we're judging something that is too wonderful for us to understand. Just because I shared the other story when you want to be a foster parent, there's a couple trainings on, hey, judging the biological parents will not be helpful for your kids, nor will it be helpful for you. So when you say mom neglected kid, she's a monster, that is not helpful for anybody. The training says, well, let's consider a situation in which somebody could end up neglecting their kid. Their husband gets cancer and dies instantaneously. They never went to college. They were stay at home. Their parents are deceased and they have no family wealth. And now they're working 2 jobs. The kid's crying. They've got to cook for the other kid. So in a moment, with no support and no resources, they do this thing that they themselves regret. Does it make them a monster? We had to hear scenario after scenario about how people get their kids taken from them. Because when you hear a little of the backstory, you start to think, well, that probably won't be me because I've got a wide support network, but I could understand a little bit that if you didn't have that, maybe. Talking to the moms in the room, we all know not to shake a baby. But if you don't know why people shake babies, you're lying to yourself. Or you haven't been alone with one long enough, right? I know not to do it. And thank God, I only had to use my emergency hotline like once and say, honey, you better get home right now because I'm about to lose my mind. And she came home and I settled down and we were all fine and there was no threat of violence in the home, thank God. But you know, like you don't know your breaking point until you find yourself at your breaking point. And I got parents, I got neighbors that would come over. What if I didn't have? I don't even need them to come over. I just know they would. Makes it a lot easier than knowing they won't. And I wonder if sometimes we don't speak about things which we have not understood that are too wonderful for us tonight. I hope this was fun enough. Next week, we'll start with a video on chapter 2. We'll talk about Revelation. If you're ever missing anything, let me know and we'll get it taken care of. Carolyn, it's really great to see you and be with you somewhat in the room. It beats the alternative a lot.